Good morning, everyone. Greetings to all of you, and we're delighted that you were able to join us for this important discussion that we will have this morning. This is part of our series of talks that we've organized as a result of course, not being able to get together for our executive education forum at University of Southern California Sol Price School of Public Policy, and our effort to, of course, reach out to our both elected as well as appointed officials, local leaders, which is part of our program. We're delighted today to be able to present, of course, a topic near and dear to our hearts. And of course, I'm delighted to have one of my favorite colleagues, Antonio Bento, of our school, moderating this discussion with Drew Murphy of Southern California Edison. This is very, very important to us. This is part of our series of talks that we've already gone through, where we had discussions on future of infrastructure and bond financing in October. We talked about the public transportation topic as well, municipal solid waste. Now we're talking about electrification and sustainability and smart cities concept, which is the way of the future, frankly. And of course, we're going to be culminating the series of 6 with our City Manager Summit coming up on November 19. Please tune in for that as well, where we're hoping to have well over 100 city managers to join us on 3 different panels to discuss topics like sustainability, where we're going to involve all of the various sectors that participate, as well as housing, and of course, what we're doing on COVID at USC. And some of our colleagues at the Schaefer Center are doing some great stuff. So that being said, we're being heard, of course, on Zoom and Facebook Live. And what we do with these programs, if you can't attend, of course, we record them, save them, and share them in our community, which is absolutely wonderful. For those of you who are joining us, please put your questions into the Q&A part, and we will do our best to address them all. With that, I'm going to turn over to my dear friend, colleague, Antonio Bento.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Frank, for the invitation, and of course, to the organizers for including me in this important discussion today. As you know, I am an applied economist at the Price School who has been doing a fair amount of work on topics related to climate change and smart cities. And given the broad topic of today's webinar, I thought it was important to start my motivation with a few thoughts that hopefully will foster some discussion amongst us. So first of all, I'm a firm believer that we are in a crucial moment in history where we really need to rethink most of what we do in cities, starting precisely with the goals of reducing overall energy consumption. This is because if there is any hope to move forward with carbon neutrality by 2050, we really need to rethink the future of our urban centers. And I would say with 2 major goals, use less energy and of course take advantage of periods where intermittent renewable energy is available. And it seems to me that the concept of smart cities within the discussion is a very important one, because the idea of using technological advances and big data as a way to manage how we act in cities and how we gather information in cities can certainly help us move forward with these goals. But it seems to me that the message that I want to convey today is that these technological advances are important, but the smart tool alone won't get us there. And this is precisely where I'm going to open up the discussion, that they need to be coupled with a series of public policy instruments that, in principle, are being implemented at higher levels of government, but as we shall see in a second, should be complemented through local action. And so, of course, before I get into a series of examples that hopefully will open up questions and foster a very productive discussion, I think it is important for us to set the stage of the presentation with a very simple definition of smart cities. And I would argue that the simplest way for us to understand what we mean by smart cities is to realize that we now have in front of us vast amount of data that are often dispersed within agencies that may not even communicate with one another, that if somehow we were able to put all this data together, we could certainly argue that that would increase efficiency in cities and potentially accountability and improvements of the way we conduct many of the government activities. And so how do we do that? We do that because we have a unique opportunity with advances in machine learning from computer science and Internet of Things to really couple incredibly large sources of data that map and read how each of us is consuming our energy, how we are moving in cities, how are cities potentially responding to disasters, etc. Now, this is going to be very important because faced with climate change, we certainly ought to define strategies for mitigating and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but perhaps at the local level, we should immediately also think about how we could use these sources of data as predictable tools with the idea of making our cities more resilient and actually facilitating a variety of climate adaptation projects. And the final thought related to smart cities is the idea that with this amount of data now available to government officials as well as to citizens, I would argue that what this data revolution is effectively creating is a unique opportunity to increase efficiency of government as well as accountability of government agencies. So here are a series of examples based on successful applications throughout the world where through big data, we have managed to improve, for example, traffic management. We have created with startup companies new applications that when connected, allow drivers to minimize the time looking for parking, which is particularly important in downtown areas where cruising for parking is often one of the chief reasons for congestion and pollution in downtown areas. We can think of using these data sources also to track remote working, and actually by coupling with traffic data, develop solutions for more flexible working schedules that indeed increase the productivity of workers and the output produced in cities. And an area that I've been working quite a bit, which I will show you in a second, we could also now rely on relatively cheap monitors to monitor pollution at such disaggregated levels that allow families and individuals to track their levels of exposure and potentially immediately think of a series of activities to reduce their exposure to pollution. And of course, when it comes to energy, the idea of using these technologies through smart meter applications is also very interesting because it allows you not only to conserve energy, but actually to adjust your consumptions to the times for which supply and demand will be better met. I want to give you a few examples based on my own research and the research of others. And so I'm going to start with a few examples from transportation, in partly because if the goal here is to think about smart cities from the perspective of climate change, it seems to me that we need to think about how we can use those to cut and adapt three key sectors: transportation, power, and of course the consumption of electricity, and then of course the building sector more general. Of course, I've done mostly work on transportation, and I'm going to give you a series of examples related to transportation, building, for example, on two cases from Singapore and Los Angeles. Let's start with the case of Singapore, where, for example, the government shares anonymized data from individuals. So this is a point perhaps of contention, which is how much are we willing to share a lot of the things that we do daily to feed into databases that then can increase the efficiency of various operations. But in the example of Singapore, it's quite interesting because through the sharing in real time of private data, you can then feed these into private bus operators to actually redesign routes for buses that adjust depending on community demand. And this has been a very successful project, both from the perspective of reducing emissions as well as reducing private car use. In the case of Los Angeles, one of the examples in mobility that I will be talking about is actually the express lanes, because what is interesting about the express lanes in Los Angeles, in the I-10 and the I-110, is that the price to enter the express lane adjusts almost in real time to actually secure that the speed in these lanes never drops below 45 miles per hour. And the point I'm going to make is that through this algorithm that adjusts the price in almost real time, we are actually creating a new market for mobility activities here in California, because if you are what I would call an urgent driver, in other words, a driver that is about to miss a very important meeting, for example, in downtown LA, and if you could purchase just the time that you need to be rerouted and be on time, the express lanes could actually provide that service to you. Again, this is only possible because you now have in your cars or in your phones technology that gives you an expected arrival time, and then you have the ability to enter a program that is also managed in real time, with the tolls adjusting precisely to secure you a minimum speed that basically minimizes the likelihood that you would arrive late to a meeting. So more general, these technologies are very interesting because in the context of energy, they can also record in real-time consumption information, and therefore map various activities that residents are doing, allowing us then to think about how to design incentives to adjust some of those activities. Let me give you a few thoughts on shortcomings at the present time, and then I will drill a little bit into some additional examples. While we've made a lot of progress with these technologies for an area like ours in Southern California, I would argue that there are possible coverage gaps because For example, if you think about transportation, a lot of the trips that end up in Los Angeles start outside of Los Angeles County, and we don't have a comprehensive way of track all these drivers. So for example, we can track you when you are on some of the freeways, but the minute you get off the freeways, it becomes harder. And certainly we don't have express lanes running throughout the entire region. And so here I leave you with a few thoughts on how these gaps can end up creating problems if our goal was to maximize the efficiency in cities. Just to zoom in into the Express Lane program, the Express Lane program is very interesting. So if you take the I-10 program, the I-10 corridor essentially has these little red and blue dots in the lanes where sensors are tracking the flow and speed of the cars in the different lanes of the freeway. And of course, if you are a driver that is about to enter the express lane, in principle, you have a transponder in your car. And the minute you enter, you get a signal is sent to the central station that manages the program that detects that a new car entered. That car then feeds into an algorithm that calculates the expected speed for the next 5 minutes, and then the price adjusts precisely to secure that speed never drops between 45 miles per hour. This is a great example of smart cities and smart data. I would argue that another feature of this program that made it quite successful was the idea that in addition to use real-time data, the program was designed in a way that drivers could actually purchase specific subsegments of the market, allowing them really to use just a portion that they needed. In a project that we've conducted, just to give you a sense of what I mean by big data, researchers can now collect massive amounts of data on travel patterns. So for example, through sensors that are under the freeways, you can measure flows and speeds in real time, and then you can match that with confidential data that we've obtained through the transponder used by Metro on individuals that would give you individual time use, points of entry and exit, toll paid, vehicle characteristics, etc. And this is important because I want to make the point of efficiency. If you think about here in this table, I have the users broken down by time savings by deciles. And what has been surprising about this program is that the vast majority of the users that participate in this program actually only need very, very small amounts of time to get to their destination on time. And this is how valuable this program is. So think about by decile 5, a driver using the express lane is basically saving 3 minutes. And this actually highlights the power of big data because 3 minutes, for example, may be all you need to arrive on time for check-in in an airport and don't miss your plane. And this is only possible, again, because through a series of sensors coordinated with Waze and other applications, you now have the information to optimize your routes. For you to see how important this is, most individuals in the morning have major meetings starting at the hour. And so when we look at the usage of express lanes, we actually see peaks, not surprisingly, the half hour before the hour. And this is often because once you leave the express lanes, you still need often to look for parking. The other example I want to talk about relates to pollution measurement. So we have at the moment a partnership with the Klima, and the Klima used Google Cars to map streets here in LA, in the Bay Area, now in other cities throughout the country. And in doing so, it installed pollution sensors on top of these cars that, as you can imagine, allows us to measure the process of pollution and allows us to also understand a lot better how traffic density correlates with various pollutants. Now, this is very important in Los Angeles because, of course, we have been for a very long time out of attainment with ozone standards. And so this graph here shows the evolution of traffic density along the hours of the day, as well as pollution formation, both the precursors of ozone and ozone emissions. And what you can see is that by managing traffic and essentially introduce strategies that smooth the peak of the peak, you could potentially simultaneously reduce the pollution that comes out of vehicles. Of course, these can be then coupled with electrification strategies, but actually before we move forward, I want to make a point here, which is we can certainly use all these strategies, but when we look, for example, at the transportation sector, what we are seeing is that greenhouse gas emissions from transportation continue to increase despite the fuel economy improvements that we have seen in passenger vehicles. And this is precisely because vehicle miles traveled continue to go up. And so both through the Express Lanes program, both through this new project, what my research group has been trying to do is to figure out how we can then design strategies that would reduce vehicle miles travel with the goal of simultaneously reducing greenhouse gas emissions and local air pollution. I'm about to wrap up. I want to also put a plug for another very interesting technology that now provides us real-time data. I'm sure after my presentation, you are going to put your address and learn about all the pollution that you're being exposed. So I just leave you with two maps. With purple air sensors, you can have sensors both inside and outside of your house. So if you live close to a road that is relatively busy, probably until recently, you couldn't really get accurate measurements of pollution because if you rely on the fixed monitors, those would only give you proximate measures for the real exposure that you are getting. Just to give you a sense of the variability in pollution, here you have the levels around Long Beach, which are in the upper 60s and 70s, and those contrast, for example, with what we were seeing this morning in Silver Lake, that was in the lower 20s. So this is a very, in my opinion, a very good example, because what it does is it gives local officials an opportunity to really design a series of initiatives with the goal of controlling pollution at a very localized level. I wrap up just by saying that these technologies are very important from the perspective of designing climate adaptation and climate mitigation strategies. And I look forward to the discussion, and I certainly can touch on some of those additional applications in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks for that. Really, really great overview of all that's going on in the smart city space as you're looking at it. You know, just by way of background, for those who don't know enough about Edison. So I'm at Edison International, which is the holding company, the parent company of Southern California Edison, which for those of you locally, you'll probably know as one of the the large utilities in California. We're publicly traded, unlike LADWP, which is owned by the city and operated by the city, but we work very closely with them and the other utilities in the area. We've got our coverage, our service area covers about 50,000 square miles. We serve 15 million residents approximately in Southern California and up into the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada. So we think about all of the things that Antonio talked about all the time, but we tend to look at it through a lens that is maybe a little bit broader than individual cities. We look at things more on a systemic basis often because we we do cover so much territory, and our wires and connect and provide electricity to pretty much every home and business in that service territory. So we're sort of woven into the fabric of the communities and the cities that we serve. So as I thought about the topic for today, maybe trying to give a little bit of an additional or different spin to talking about smart cities and resiliency, maybe I'll start with really a focus on resiliency, if I can, because for us as a critical infrastructure owner and service provider, we think about every day how we can make sure that we are focused on resiliency to keep the lights on. Our primary mission is to make sure that we're providing our communities, the cities, and all the communities that we serve with clean, resilient, reliable, and affordable electricity. And that mission, when you put it in the context of climate change and what we're trying to do as a state and as our company, but all of us in our communities, of reducing greenhouse gas emissions and making sure that we're providing our service in a sustainable way, that really highlights a lot of the areas of opportunity that Antonio, you talked about, because we know that as we go forward, if we're going to move to some of the goals that we have as a company and the state, which is to deliver, more and more clean energy, zero carbon energy delivered by 2045, which is we know that to do that, not only are we going to have to clean up the sources of electricity, so that's one thing, but back to the smart cities piece, we're going to actually have to make sure that the infrastructure embedded in our communities, all of our wires and our infrastructure, but that all the infrastructure owned by and operated by other parties, the cities themselves, the governments, but individuals, residents, businesses, that they're all part of a larger system that can function together in a way that is data-driven, that is driven by analytics, that is driven by machine learning, all the things you said, because, and we saw some of this summer, maybe I'll touch on it a little bit. We had, as many of you who live here will recall, we had some rolling outages in August and into early September, which is not a place you want to be. We don't want to be there as a society, our cities don't want to be there. We don't want to be there as the provider of the electric service. And there were a lot of contributing factors to that, including really severe hot weather across the whole Western United States and other sort of what I would call supply side issues. But on the demand and the supply side, to the smart cities point, one of the things that we saw was really important, both in creating some of the conditions that may have led to us having some shortages and needing outages, but also avoiding those outages on some days and keeping them shorter when they happen, was the ability to call on resources, the solar resources, storage, people turning down their thermostats, adjusting their load. So actually have people in real time adjust their energy consumption and supply energy back to the grid if they had it in storage, those kinds of things. We're just at the early days of being able to do that in a much more connected and data-driven way. So when I think about resiliency and smart cities or smart communities, which is how we talk about it, we really think of things in that systemic way, where we are trying to make sure we see how they're connected, and especially around electricity, since it's going to be more and more the fuel that drives all of the engines of our communities and our cities, our economic growth and our daily life. We're going to need to make sure that it's being done in a way that's much smarter and much more connected. I'll maybe just make one more point related to that, and then Antonio, I'd love to sort of see where you want to take this, but
sure.
Because there's lots of directions we can go here. We've been looking at this idea of how do we get to 2045. So last year we released this paper on this again on the sort of the renewable energy and clean energy side of what the pathway is to 2045 across the economy, and that's just not only cleaning up the electric sector, but it's cleaning up the rest of the economy, especially transportation sector. And so you mentioned transportation examples, and transportation is a huge part of what it will mean to have smart, sustainable communities and cities. But we've also been looking at how to make sure that what does the grid need to look like in 2045 at that same point? How do we get there from here? And it's really clear to us now that it's going to have to be very connected, very technology that's going to have to be layered on physical assets with then internet connected and sensors and communications technologies, operational technologies that are very smart, and then a whole, these layers that will help everything be controlled. And then there's going to be a whole layer of behavioral issues that you cited and policy issues that will have to allow us to figure out how to incentivize and cause people to use those technologies together in a way that makes sense, and market policies as well. So there's a lot of different pieces to what it makes to even think about what a smart grid, a future grid will look like, let alone a transportation system, which is going to be part of that grid, right? Because it will be electric. So maybe that's a lot. It's a bit of a scattershot.
That's great. And so perhaps to start our conversation, we could zoom in a little bit in the beginning of several points that you've made, and maybe interesting for our audience to learn a little bit about how your external partners are interacting with you precisely to maximize the potential benefit that comes through this smart cities movement and interaction with your organization.
Yeah, it's a really great topic, and I guess what I'd say is there's a lot of different ways that we are interacting with external parties. Maybe just sort of go through them. One, if we think about our customers, let's talk about residential and small business, but residential customers. We have programs right now that we're looking at where we're helping people put in smart thermostats that are connected so that we can actually help them not only save money day to day, that's part of it, but in these events where they become part of the grid management supply system when we need to manage the grid differently, and so that they can actually have their thermostats be part of that. And hopefully when you get to scale, what happens is you have that management of your temperature, your thermostat, or your other home devices in a way that is actually not very noticeable, because you have enough scale that you're managing hot water heaters and thermostats and other devices. So we're just at the early stages, Antonio, seeing that beginning to happen with electric vehicles, right? We have the highest penetration of electric vehicles here in California, anywhere in the country, but we're still early days, and we need to really ramp that up. But as we see more people plugging in at home, plugging in at work, part of what we will see is our customers again being part of the management of the grid. So right now we do that through time of use rates. So we incentivize people really in a fairly not a very sophisticated market way, which is to provide pricing signals. Ultimately, when we have more connected electric vehicles, we can do that through actually managing how fast they're charging at any given time, and we can manage that at scale. That's early days, but the industry is talking about it. There are companies that are developing business models to actually do that. Some are already doing some pilots with some of the charging companies. So that's one way through programs like that. We do. Look, we also we engage all the time with companies who can provide us with new grid technologies that will help us be smarter, use more digital technology. We have a whole digital business transformation team inside the company that's looking at how do we interact with the grid more digitally. So we have a whole grid modernization program as well.
Right. And the reason why I was asking about these collaborations with external partners is, of course, because with the goal of having carbon neutrality by 2050, this is a rather ambitious goal, and of course, your group is going to play a major role in that transition here in Southern California. And so I wonder whether you could tell us a little bit about exactly the details of your climate ambition and also how you plan to achieve it. I think that not only I, but all present here would like to know a little bit more about that.
Yeah, well, look, and so I think you're absolutely right, Antonio, that it's going to take a lot of collaboration. And so when we look at the goal that the state has of, as they say, carbon neutrality by 2045, and reaching the 80% greenhouse gas reduction by 2050, right? Which is sort of the 1.5 degree scenario that we're all trying to hold ourselves to. That's extremely ambitious. What's really interesting, of course, is we have in California, we're lucky, we have a lot of popular support for it. And the Public Policy Institute does these great polls every year that shows how much support the California citizens have for these programs. So that's the first thing, is we actually have support of our of people in the state to do these things and to spend the money and the resources making sure we can do them in a smart way. For us, what we are really, our view is that we play one central role, but we're only one actor in this, to your point. So the only way we're going to get to our goals, which are aligned with that, which is electrifying more of our own fleet, helping our customers electrify their transportation, making sure we get to those clean energy goals in time. We know that we're going to have to make sure that we work at the state level, to your point of the original point, to policy. We spend a lot of time in Sacramento and a lot of time with our local government officials, trying to help them understand, and our regulators understand what policies we need for us to be the enabler of these things, and help. And then we also spend a lot of time with industry. So we talk to all the car manufacturers, all of them, the traditional ones, the new ones. We have great relationships across the transportation sector. We're talking to all the other energy companies all the time about what they're doing. And we're talking to all of our large and small customers around what their needs and issues are going to be and how they can help us. So it takes policy, it takes coalitions across industry to do this. And so that's the only way we're going to be successful, I think.
Right. And I'm sure many of the participants here today represent different local governments. And perhaps we could discuss a little bit also what is the role, very much like what I outlined in my initial slide, what is the role that you envision for local governments to play? Of course, at a higher level, we eventually will need, not only we would need to continue to have more aggressive state and federal policies, and of course all the support that comes with it, but then there are many things that could be done at the local level to facilitate this transition. Can you give us a few examples on how you see this?
Local governments are so important on this. You're absolutely right. I mean, look, state policy is great. We have, in state funding particularly, you need, states are one of the best places to get funding for some of these programs, like the money we're getting from Cap and Trade that goes into some of the programs like the zero emission vehicles programs. But really, to figure out how to solve some of these much more, some of these really on the ground issues, we need local governments. And I think they're a great place where we look to do a lot of pilots and look for different solutions. Maybe a couple of examples, particularly in the transportation space now, our charge ready programs for both light duty vehicles, and heavy duty vehicles, which is a program where we have money that the PUC allows us to spend, which is collected from our customers, but we spend it on helping customers who want to have electric vehicles put charging infrastructure in their workplaces, in their apartment buildings or other multi-unit, multi-family dwellings. And that's both light duty, and now we have a whole heavy duty program. We're focused on doing that at the port, for instance. Those programs absolutely require a lot of local government support and engagement, because we need not only just from permitting and siting, but helping us to contact the business owners, helping us contact the owners of the apartment buildings and the multifamily unit dwellings where we need to put this infrastructure. If they're supportive, it makes it a lot easier for us to get in there and help put in the charging infrastructure that's going to be needed. So we work very closely with those folks all the time. And I think to the extent that local governments can have a view on what they want for their citizens, that it'll help create sustainability and help make sure that we're addressing climate change in the long term, but also local air quality and other environmental issues in the short term. That's really important. I wanted to make sure I touch on the fact that, a large focus of ours is making sure that when we do these programs, we're also focused on the environmental justice aspects of them. And you showed an interesting map where you were showing the air quality, the index, the purple sensors. And, I looked at that and I felt really, it just sort of encapsulated. I live near Griffith Park. So look, I'm fortunate. I live in an area which typically is got cleaner air. And that's because I'm fortunate to be able to live there. But you live down in Long Beach or other places along the 710, et cetera, and the air quality is consistently worse there because of the infrastructure that's there. We are, by focusing on electrifying and cleaning the energy system and the transportation system, we can actually improve the quality of life and health for those communities that are experiencing that and that are disadvantaged because of where they are already. And so that's another message I would send to the local government officials, is that we want to partner with you on those efforts.
What I was going to ask you is, you touched precisely on this issue of social equity, and you mentioned the revenues from the cap and trade program that come from the state. I wonder what is that you are doing in a sense to complement those actions with the goal of promoting and including social equity in the decisions regarding infrastructure, for example, as well as the design of resilience plans more broadly.
Yeah, well, in the infrastructure, just take again electric vehicle infrastructure as an example. In our Charge Ready 2 program, which was just approved by the California Public Utilities Commission a month or so ago, one of the pieces of that program that we designed with their input and the input of the communities was to make sure that we were a portion of that that charging infrastructure is going to be directed to low income and disadvantaged communities. So we have a portion of it that has to go into those communities and set aside to make sure it is. And so that means that we're going to be aggressively trying to make sure we're addressing some of that, at least where the infrastructure goes for charging. More broadly, on climate change and resiliency, again, it's sort of it's part of how we try to approach all of the decisions that in the analysis we do about where we need to invest in hardening and updating our system. So when we look at climate change and how to make sure that our system is going to be resilient and is going to be able to withstand wildfires, for instance, or other climate events, we add an overlay in there always of what's the impact of the local communities and the people in them, and how can we make sure we're making sure that we're minimizing the impact to those folks. Particularly, an example of that in recently, I know you've all seen that we've had to have public safety power shutoffs to try to avoid wildfires being caused by weather conditions that might interact with our system. Not something we want to do if we don't have to, but in certain cases we do shut the power off to make sure that we're providing, we're making it safe for the public. As we've done that, we've tried to design, we've partnered with a lot of the local communities to make sure that we're identifying those people in communities that are most at risk if power goes out, that have critical needs, nursing homes, things like that. And we communicate that with them ahead of time. We have plans in place for, in some cases, providing backup power or other alternatives. So, again, that's the kind of lens that we bring to working with communities to try to, again, be smart about how our infrastructure is being used.
But of course, to move forward, in the end of the day, we're going to need a fair amount of additional financial resources to really deliver on these goals. So I would like to hear a little bit your take on that, and in particular, what do you think is the minimum necessary for us to really achieve these low carbon economy goals?
I think I think you can look at it through two lenses. There's going to be a lot of funding. That's true, and we haven't yet quantified ourselves. The total funding. I think there's probably some folks who may try to look at that even across the whole system. I know that in our Pathway 2045 paper, we did a rough estimate that to get to 2045 and just in terms of investment in the grid in the system that and the renewables and the storage that are going to have to go on the grid. You know, there was $75 billion of investment over the next 25, 30 years. That sounds like a lot. It is a lot, but it's also going to be investment that will provide benefits, both in terms of the climate benefits, but also actually financial economic benefits. I mean, as we did some of the modeling, if you look at a highly electrified society where people with clean energy, you can actually get a lot of efficiencies out of using electrification more widely, so that the cost to individual customers on average, we think will go down over time in terms of their overall energy usage as they trade off using fossil fuels for a bigger slice of their wallet and use much more efficient electric technologies. We all know that electric vehicle motors are much more efficient than internal combustion engines, for instance, on an energy basis. So there's a lot of investment. It's an opportunity for us to create new jobs and to create a different economy. We have to be smart about it. There also will need to be a lot of, as you say, a fair amount of funding through government channels. But again, we think that can be done in a way that is also consistent with economic growth and economic development, and creates new economic opportunities, especially for people in the communities that we serve.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very good. We probably should open for questions to bring others into the dialogue, if you agree.
Yeah.
So I would ask the audience to raise their questions, and I will pass to Frank. I think he will moderate, right, Frank?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you. This is a great dialogue, obviously. And one of our students who says that he is a Chinese student and is asking a question, do you think that the smart city concept has a positive influence on the high price of house in Shanghai or Beijing, for example? I guess you can extrapolate and take that the rest of the world, whether or not that's going to have an effect or not.
Well,
you're the economist, Antonio, so
I can try to get an answer to that. So first of all, studies have shown over and over again that there is a relationship between your willingness to pay for a house and the amenities there are surrounding your house, right? And so what I would say, the answer to that question goes as follows. The more information that as a private citizen you now have access to through these various technologies, the more accurate are going to be the prices that we'll observe in housing markets. So, I gave you the example of the Purple Air sensors. Imagine just a few years ago, we suspected that air pollution was certainly much worse along busy highway corridors or even busy regular roads, but we did not know exactly how far would those travel. And if we were to use the fixed monitors from the US EPA, the best we could do would be to extrapolate the surface of pollution, which would typically give us a much more uniform pattern of pollution than the one that we actually see when we have these detailed sensors. So I suspect that all of these will make markets more efficient, and the housing prices and the variability of housing prices along the metropolitan area are just going to be a manifestation of more information that individuals now have access to.
Yeah, I would add if you think about it from an energy perspective, we think, ultimately when smart home technologies are deployed again at scale, and homes are part of a broader market in terms of connected to the grid and may participate in sort of the energy markets more. We think that the value that's created by being connected that way can actually be a value stream that offsets the cost, more than offsets the cost of installing the technology at a time, especially as technology costs come down for all of the devices and all of that. So, I think there's a strong case that can be said that smart homes in smart cities can actually be more affordable, both from an energy consumption and a value creation standpoint.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm going to segue from that, and I'll ask my own follow-up question because, as both of you know, I teach governance, and I was talking to my students before we got on. I told you both that I was teaching in Rennes in France overnight, and I was talking to them the importance of collaborative governance in the 21st century, and the importance of looking at various things that we take for granted differently. And by that, I mean, for example, let's take the example of waste, and I'll come to your topic, Drew, electricity, to illustrate my point. People have looked at waste as waste. Well, waste is much more than waste. And I presume electricity, what you provide mainly, is much more than electricity. And I think you touched on one aspect of electricity in a smart home and the advantages it provides across the board, whether it's climate change mitigation, whether it's efficiency, effectiveness, etc. First, I'll turn to you, Drew, and then I'll go back to Antonio about the economic effects of that governance collaboration. And particularly, I'm thinking of my colleagues who are mayors and council members who may be online and watching us now. And because I'm going to ask the next question. But first, if you can comment on what I said on this collaboration and for people behaviorally to think about electricity differently, what would you advise?
Well, look, again, maybe I agree with you. I maybe just go back to the point it always strikes me about the business that I'm in. We, our electricity and for instance, our wires that we own and operate on behalf of our customers connect every home and business in 50,000 square miles. So think that is by its nature a collaborative system, right? In a sense, because we're spanning, lots and lots of different sort of governance boundaries. We require, we have to essentially collaborate with everybody along that system to make it stay in balance. It isn't a series of separate things. You can sectionalize some, but in essence, it's a single system. So that is an analogy for what you're saying, Frank, for me, from electricity. That's my point. As you connect it and use it for more uses, it has greater value across, that society and for all those people that are connected to it. And so, electricity and energy usage to me is the ultimate sort of collaborative, one of the ultimate collaborative commodities. We have to figure out how to, the more we figure out how to collaborate on it, how we use it, how we manage it, and the value we get from it, the more value we will get out of it, I think. And that's a very different way of thinking about things and a lot of how energy has been used and produced and sold, and I think in the country generally in places. So I like your model. I think that's where we're moving. We collaborate all the time, as I said, with the various local governments, members of this transportation electrification partnership that Lacey has convened, and we've got state, local governments. We got folks like us. We've got LEWP, but we're all trying to solve the same problems. And I have. To me, what I've seen in the last 5 years, especially as the more people have woken up to the need to address this clean energy transition where we're going, is in a willingness for people to put aside sort of more competitive or territorial normal sort of concerns and figure out how to solve things on a systemic basis, which requires collaboration.
Antonio?
I am going to take a slightly different take on your question. And share a few experiences that I've had with local governments on this business of smart cities, because Drew's example of electrification, and to a certain extent at the end of the day the management of demand for electricity, is assuming we could overcome all the behavioral issues associated with how consumers respond. In principle, I would say that conceptually is a relatively simpler problem, because if somehow we could start storing the renewable energy that we produce and manage the demand with time of use pricing, we would move forward, and certainly we would not only conserve more, but we would improve the efficiency and the reliability of the system. But I think the topic of energy transitions and all the problems that we have in cities, whether it's air pollution, whether it's traffic, requires a new way of thinking of local government management. And so what we have seen is relatively larger cities have literally created centers of operation where, with data analysts and with public policy experts, they now serve as a repertoire of various data sources that, when together, they can actually inform a lot of action that happens at the local level. Now, what I think it's important for us to discuss here, and I think Southern California is a very good example, is that not all cities have the size or the capacity to have those types of operation rooms, so to speak, that combine all these data sources. And if we take, for example, the case of how could you use this smart data for better management of traffic, what I actually envision in our region is a form of collaboration that brings together the private providers, for example, the Ubers, but also the local governments, in a way that there is more coordination. Because if somehow there was a place where all this data was shared and would then allow each of the cities to realize that the way they manage traffic affects their neighbors, therefore somehow a more collaborative solution would benefit everybody, I think that would be the way forward to think about smart cities in regions like ours that are connected by this multitude of jurisdictions. So it seems to me that for handling the power, all the things that Drew was saying, again, with the caveat of overcoming a lot of the behavioral issues, because, you know, consumers are not 24/7 looking at their smart meters and adjusting. And so we need to figure out a way to educate them, right? On transportation, I think is much harder because it's gonna require what I would call a new concept of smart governance that cuts across the traditional boundaries of our individual jurisdictions, right?
Antonio,
Yeah.
let me come
I
back
agree
for a
with you.
second. I'll come back to Drew in just a second, but let me come back in something that you said here and maybe offer and ask your opinion about that, whether or not something like an MPO like SCAG, for example, can be the catalyst for local jurisdictions that are small enough, but yet regionally big enough to be able to accommodate the things that you're talking about. Is that something that is possible? Because we have a lot of small cities. We don't have a lot of LAs, obviously, but we do have a lot of Rolling Hills Estates of the world in California that can join through a regional effort through a SCAG in order to be able to do it. Am I on the right track here, or?
Yes, and I think that this is also where institutions like SCAG can have potentially very productive collaborations with universities, right? Because I'm going to give you a specific example in comparison to Los Angeles. As you know, I worked a little bit with Bloomberg Philanthropics when I was at Cornell to help establish the operations center in the city of Rio de Janeiro, right? And this problem of capacity building was one that emerged because the minute we moved away from Sao Paulo and Rio, all the smaller cities said, well, we would also like to have the data that allows us to manage these heat waves or these major episodes of extreme weather events so that we can protect our citizens, but we just don't have the capacity. And I think that that capacity gets overcome when you have an institution that does not have the same oversight as a small jurisdiction and can almost serve as an aggregator. So it's not that you are removing the decision making from the jurisdictions, but you are providing what I would argue is a big data open platform source that they can rely on. And I actually want to say that I've been a huge advocate, as you well know, Frank, that even the way we train individuals in public policy and public administration needs to evolve, precisely because the wave of big data was taken much faster by the private sector than it has done by local governments. And again, this is a capacity building issue that once solved, you can imagine could really increase the productivity of cities and make them a lot more resilient, for example, to climate disasters.
Drew, the topic of resiliency and the topic of certainly local governments collaborating both regionally and as well as, with our partners, what kind of, I don't, help is probably the wrong word, but what kind of help do you think that the utility needs in order for us at the local level to be able to kind of open the road for collaboration instead of, at times, competition among those interests, for example? Because I view your role as part of governance of local governments, and at times we act as though we're competing with one another. How can we facilitate a better collaboration?
Yeah, I think it's something I think it's a really good question, and I really don't think we should be viewed as competing on most things, as you say, Frank. I guess I would say it starts with trying to identify some common objectives that can be worked on in the near to medium term, probably, and so having those conversations, which we try to participate in through some of our regional councils and other things, but understanding what the particular needs of each of the communities, of the areas that we serve, because as you said, there's just there's so many different entities, right? And everyone has their own objective. We could finding a way to sort of identify some things we work on in common together to solve that are consistent with promoting real resiliency and, I would say, long-term sustainability. If we could use I think if you use those lenses with local governments, I think that can help change the conversation from maybe the older sort of business model or who owns what asset or something, which may have made it feel a little bit more competitive. But if we use resiliency and long-term clean sustainability as the lens we're all trying to get to for the people in that community, because that's certainly our goal. Our strategy doesn't succeed without that, and the local governments won't either, I don't think. That might be a way to make sure we're having the conversation around what can we do together today. Again, I use some of the local partnerships we've been involved in recently. I think that's been helpful to have that lens of how do we promote a sustainable outcome, how do we promote a resilient outcome that gets everybody something that they want to do. So
yeah, I think what Antonio said resonates with me, not because I wear both hats of academia as well as local office and local jurisdiction, but in my judgment, unfortunately, and the blame goes both ways, universities are not very well used by local governments, and universities do not reach out to local governments to be able to be used. So a program like ours, for example, and I'm not saying this to bolster what we do, a program like ours that I am happy to say from day one, supported by organizations like yours, for example, Edison, on a regular basis, is precisely the kind of collaborations that can bring all of this together. And this is why this kind of a program that we do is so important for our community out there in order to be able to educate. And I'll give you a perfect case on point that even in my community, outages are not cool. I mean, they're for you and I that open up the refrigerator, it's not the greatest thing to have. I mean, that's just the way it is. But that being said, you're in a risky business. You're in a business that actually most of us take for granted that when we're going to flip the button, that the light is going to come on. But what helped, for example, in my community, even though there was an outage, is when we invited government affairs people from Edison to come and explain to people what happened.
Yeah.
And for the most part, this is what's lacking. What happens most of the time is, that's where I said the competition occurs, when people don't know and they have no knowledge and there's no transparency and accountability. Because Edison came, they were transparent in what happened, and they were accountable. They said, hey, our bad. And most of, it vanished. The issue went away. I mean, people said, okay, we get it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great example. But I also, programs like this, and I'm glad that you feel that way. We make an effort to support programs like this, so that our view is that we need to help develop local officials, people who are going to run for office, people who are going to serve on boards, people who are going to be involved in their communities. And we want to get to them early on, especially. So we sponsor leadership training types of organizations. And then our goal is to educate them about our business. So exactly, Frank. We want them to understand what our objectives are and sort of our constraints and what we're trying to do. But we also want to hear from them, what are they trying to solve for? That's my point. But if we bring that lens that we're all trying to get to a resilient, sustainable outcome, environmentally better outcome for our citizens, for our communities, I actually think you start with that common ground. I hope that makes the conversation easier. But you're right. You also got to have people who are willing to be transparent and accountable on both sides. I have to tell you, I worked in the East Coast, just in New York for a long time. The governance here in Southern California is probably one of the most interesting things I've found, because it is so diffuse. There are so many different governance bodies, so many different cities, localities, and there is not a great framework for how to bring those together. So what you're doing is really important. We want to be part of actually creating more of that, connection and systemic sort of framework. But it's hard here. It's very hard here.
We appreciate that. And so far, we've done pretty well. We've had more than 500 local leaders come through our programs, doing precisely that, where we're attempting to educate and give resources in policy and administration to be able to create that collaborative frame, if you will. Our time is kind of running out. I'm going to turn to Antonio and say any parting thoughts, and I'll come back to you, Drew, and we'll conclude our program. Any parting thoughts, Antonio?
Well, I think we've touched on most of the key issues, and I think related to some of the thoughts you were having. I would continue to argue that another major benefit of these smart city technologies is really the increased accountability and efficiency that we can create for local governments. In one hand, of course, big data and smart cities come with a potential danger of all of a sudden having information that otherwise individuals may consider to be private. But to the extent that we can find the legal arrangement for that data to be used, it seems to me that it can improve the efficiency and resiliency in cities tremendously. And then through the types of data that I demonstrated today, I think you also equip NGOs and community groups to become more active in their role and in the pressure that they put in local governments to really serve their constituencies. So I think those are my two final thoughts.
Drew, any final thoughts?
I guess I would just say, look, again, thanks for having me on. And your point about, us needing to collaborate is probably the one I would take away from this, is the main takeaway. I do strongly believe that without that desire to collaborate and share information and work together to solve these problems, I don't think we'll reach our goals as a state and as a community. Certainly not in terms of being, addressing climate change and in the meantime becoming more resilient. But I don't think we'll actually create the quality of life and economic opportunities that we all want to have here in the region. So that's I guess my parting thought is we want to be part of that effort, actually really tangibly today on the ground, but also for 2045. So let us know how we can help.
With that, I want to thank you both for participating. This has been really enlightening, and our communication group will probably produce this and put it online for others to see and share. And of course, you'll have access to it as well. Feel free to share it. We have, over time now, we have thousands of views of our programs, which is fantastic, actually. COVID has taught us one thing, and that's scaling our activities exponentially. I mean, we can only get 25, 30, maybe local leaders into our classrooms, but we're able to reach thousands of people through these programs. So I'm grateful for that, though I do miss the classroom, and I'm hoping that you both will join us one day when we're back in our classrooms and offering various programs. Thanks again, Drew, and to SoCal Edison in particular in our community, and you, of course, from being from the parent company, but still, we thank you for your time. Antonio, always a pleasure. Looking forward to reconnecting. Antonio's office and my office are on the same floor in our building. We're several offices away, but we see each other on a regular basis, and I miss that. So
Yes.
that being said, bye, everybody.